everyone
Wait.
Greetings, and thank you to everyone for tuning into our latest installment of Authors Talks. Authors Talks, a new series hosted by the Johns Hopkins Masters in Writing and Science Writing programs, features talks and readings by faculty, students, and other authors of interest. On behalf of the program, I'd like to welcome you to a virtual evening with writer Meghan ORourke and Stephanie Desmond as they discuss Meghan's New York Times bestseller, The Invisible Kingdom. Our moderator for tonight's conversation, Stephanie Desmond, is an award-winning journalist and the Director of Marketing and Public Relations for the Johns Hopkins Center for Communication Programs. She's also co-host of the Public Health on Call podcast, which recently won an Anthem Award and has been downloaded more than 7 million times. Before joining JHQ, Stephanie was a newspaper reporter for 15 years, including nearly a decade at the Baltimore Sun, where she wrote about medicine, politics, and other newsworthy topics. She's expected to receive her MA in science writing from Johns Hopkins this summer. She's a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania and lives with her family outside of Baltimore. Throughout this evening's conversation, you are invited to submit your questions by entering them in the chat box at the bottom of the screen. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Stephanie and Meghan to our virtual stage.
Thanks so much, Roslyn. Meghan, I'm going to give an introduction here and tell everyone about you. So Meghan O'Rourke is the author of the new book, The Invisible Kingdom, Reimagining Chronic Illness, which has been described as affecting, essential, and my favorite, Publishers Weekly noted, readers will be left in awe. She has also written a book, The Long Goodbye, and several poetry collections. Her writing has appeared in The Atlantic Monthly, The New Yorker, and The New York Times, and more. A former editor at The New Yorker, she has served as culture editor and literary critic for Slate, as well as poetry editor for the Paris Review. The recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Radcliffe Fellowship, and a Whiting Nonfiction Award, she resides in New Haven, where she teaches at Yale University and is the editor at the Yale Review. Welcome, Meghan.
Thanks so much, Stephanie, for that beautiful introduction, and to all of you for having me here tonight and for coming out.
Well, I'm really excited to talk to you because I got the book about 2 months ago and I was not able to put it down. I had to race through it because it was really so compelling. So I want you to talk, if you wouldn't mind sort of helping our audience today, tell us a little bit about your story and how you came to discover you had this invisible illness, one that doctors really couldn't figure out.
Yeah. So this book, as you've just intimated, grew out of my own experience of getting mysteriously ill, starting in my early 20s, more or less, but maybe even going back further than that in some ways. And I begin the book by saying I got sick the way that Hemingway says you go broke, right? Gradually and then suddenly. And in a way, this gradually and then suddenly experience, I think, is actually quite typical of certain invisible illnesses, but it goes against the grain of the kind of illness narratives that we tend to read or tell, which often have a dramatic sudden onset, right? Like the call from the doctor, the terrible test results. But mine was much vaguer. I was having strange symptoms that roamed my body, like electrical shocks that would come and go and really were horrific and painful, but no doctor could identify what they were or find them on tests or had even really heard of them at that point. And just fatigue, things like brain fog, which again are subjective and hard to measure. And so I found myself in the position of being, a young woman who had a stressful job, going from doctor to doctor and saying something seems wrong, but I don't quite know. Maybe everyone feels this way, and having them say, we think you're just stressed, or maybe it's anxiety. And, I had many really nice and wonderful doctors, but I also was a young person who was changing jobs. And so my insurance would change. And then I would lose the doctor I'd had for a long time and have to meet a new doctor. So basically this culminates with me getting really, really sick in my 30s, at which point I get diagnosed with an autoimmune disease initially, and later some other conditions. But that moment made me really interested as a writer, as a reporter, as a poet, in the question of why it had been so hard in our hyper-diagnostic age for me to get a diagnosis. Why did it take so much work for me to get doctors to listen to me, for them to take me seriously, and indeed to help me. But I also wanted, the poet in me, I think, wanted to animate the strangeness of this experience of being sick with no answers, no name, no framework. And the more that I started to write about this and to try to animate some of the loneliness of the experience, the more I realized that my story was really the story of millions of other people, right? And that in fact, we're living through what I call in the book a silent epidemic of these kinds of chronic illnesses that are often driven by immune system problems and more. And of course now long COVID. So yeah, that's really the origin of the book.
Mhm. And I guess the question is, how did you decide to write about this, right? For the writers here, how did you decide to write about it and then turn it into a book? Were you thinking in the back of your mind that someday you'd want to do this? So you kept notes and journal entries. I mean, so how did this whole process work?
Yeah. I mean, initially it didn't occur to me at all, right? I think in my 20s, it was just something I was struggling with and had no name for. And as I recount in the book, I wasn't even sure I was sick, right? I felt like something was wrong, and my levels of fatigue and sort of sudden enervation seemed really different from my peers. So at that time, I wasn't doing anything more than my usual practice of kind of, I keep a journal, I take notes, I do write about my experience sort of for my own practice as a writer. But basically in my 30s, in the year leading up to the autoimmune diagnosis, I did start to keep notes and to start searching for answers, because at that point, I was very clearly sick. Something was really not okay. And I myself, as a person, not a writer, was reading and researching to try to understand what was going on, even before I got the diagnosis, because I was searching for an answer. So I had this record of my own search, right? And then after I got the autoimmune diagnosis and got that label of autoimmune disease, I realized retroactively that several people in my family had autoimmune diseases, but I had never really understood that they were connected, right? I think like a lot of people, I didn't really know that autoimmune disease was a category, that it meant something in your immune system was going awry, and that, rheumatoid arthritis and ulcerative colitis and, Hashimoto's thyroiditis were in some sense all related.
Mm-hmm.
So when I got that diagnosis and made that connection, I thought, this is really interesting, right? The writer in me perked up, and I thought, well, this is something I didn't understand, and it's close to me, it's in my family, it's affecting me. And I also had realized in my reading that it really looked like we were living through a kind of unusual rise in these diseases that couldn't be attributed only to better diagnostics. So the reporter in me kind of, perked up, was like, this is something's going on here. I need to find out more. And I pitched a story to the New Yorker magazine about my own experience, but a story in which my own experience would shine a light on this broader category of disease and really talk about it as a category, and outline what I saw as a need at that point for a broader understanding of autoimmune disease and better ways of coordinating care. And then basically when that story was done, I wasn't done. I had more to say. And that was the moment when I told I had already published a nonfiction book. So I had an editor, and I said to her, look, I really want to write a book about illness and what I'm going through. And just quickly, I'll say, she was really hesitant at first. This was a different editor from my current editor. And she was like, I'm not sure if anyone will want to read about illness, right? I mean, she was not sure. And to her credit, she came back a few months later and said, I think I was wrong. I think this is something you absolutely should write if you still want to. But yeah.
It's interesting that she also sort of dismissed it in a way. I think something that really struck me in the book is sort of the struggle you have, right, to get someone to take your symptoms seriously. And there's a quote here. It says, one woman I interviewed told me, I wish doctors had just looked me in the eye and said, I don't know what's wrong with you, but I believe you, and one day we will figure it out. To me, that really sort of encapsulated this book in many ways. And I'm curious, sort of, what was that moment like when they said, here's the name of what you have?
It was really important that first doctor who said to me, as I describe in the book, she listened to me tell my story. She elicited that my aunts had these autoimmune diseases, which I didn't even know were autoimmune. And then she said to me, I highly suspect that you have some kind of autoimmune disease. And that moment was really important, I think, because until then I was so trapped in this mire of a lot of my energy going to the question of, is this real? Am I imagining it? Is something wrong with me? Like, am I weaker than other people for, finding life this hard, right? Those were the kinds of questions I was actually dealing with in a really pragmatic way, day by day. So that label, when she said, okay, you have autoimmune thyroiditis, really mattered. As I think a lot of chronically ill people learn, that particular diagnosis didn't explain everything, right? And being treated helped me a little bit, but it didn't make my symptoms go away. I ended up having this kind of cluster of interconnected issues. And in a way, the diagnosis also became an obstacle, because I think at that point, my doctor really wanted it to be the cause. And when I said, I'm just still not well, in a way, I became the difficult patient, right? I became the problem patient. She was great and she always treated me well. But I think in some way, there was probably some part of her that was like, wait, I've given you a label, I've given you a medication, like you should be better now. And I wasn't, right? So it was both a relief and then a kind of ongoing problem, right? Diagnosis is not the be all and end all of disease.
Did it feel really, this is a very personal story, and there's a lot of personal detail in here. Was there, I know it's hard, sort of scary to write about yourself. And I was sort of curious, when knowing you were going to get an even broader audience for this, when you published your piece, how did that feel? And were you, you like excited to get it published, but like also afraid of the reaction?
Yeah, I think I had, I've been a writer for a long time. I had written a column for 6 years, a weekly column for Slate. I was really used to putting myself out there, either my ideas or my personal story. So I think the piece itself, I was really interested, because I was interested to see the reaction, because I wanted to understand more about other people's experience. And at that point, that piece was mostly about me and then reporting on science. And I hadn't, at that stage in the writing, done a lot of reporting that involved talking to other people who lived with illness. And so I was sort of new to that community too, right? I was sort of announcing myself as a sick person. And so I was really interested to see, will other people have had this experience? And or not. Maybe I've actually had a really unusual experience. And the outpouring suggested, no, indeed, this was a very common experience. And so I think that helped fuel my realization that I had to write a book. I will say, it's quite strange. I've just spent nearly a decade writing this book, in which I do write about my own story as a way of illuminating these larger questions of other people's stories. But it did feel vulnerable to put the book in the world in a way that it didn't even feel with the piece. And I'm trying to understand why that is. And I think it's just that the book risks more. It tells you more about really the challenges, the low points of living with chronic illness, the ongoingness of it, the, illusion of recovery, and then the setback, and the ways that creates challenges in your relationships, and your changes your nature of your ambition, makes you depressed at some points, right? There's a lot of association of depression with chronic illness, not necessarily because it's causing the chronic illness or the real illness, but because being sick can be depressing, right? It can be a coincidence. And so, yeah, it has certainly felt like a new level of exposure to talk about these things. And I think also because the book is really, really clear in a way that the piece perhaps was not, that while I am much more functional now than I was at my sickest, this is something I really struggle with in an ongoing way. And it's scary to say that when you think about employment and your perception in the world and all of that. Yeah.
Do you think that any of this, the hesitance of the doctors to really find something wrong with you, I don't know, maybe not hesitance, but this whole experience, drawn out process, do you think it had anything to do with being a woman?
I do, yeah. And so there's a chapter in the book called The Woman Problem. And yeah, that's a sort of ironic title. I do. And in fact, this was my perception that as I was going to doctors and seeing them, I thought it feels like there's something about the fact that I'm a young woman that is making them really quickly dismiss my testimony. And in fact, when I began researching, that research bears that out, right? We have a lot of evidence that women are treated differently, right? When we go to ERs, when we go in complaining of heart, chest pain, we talk about pain. Women are less likely to get pain medication for men at the same levels of pain. They're more likely to get sedatives. Women undergo cardiac catheterization less often. Women of color are dramatically less often. So there's all these pre-existing biases that are probably often unconscious bias that shape how healthcare workers perceive the testimony of women about their own bodies. The other reality is that we know less about women's health. We know less about women's body. What really shocked me to discover in my reporting was that until relatively recently, so much research was done almost exclusively on biologically male animals and people. So there's just a huge amount we don't know. Like when Ambien went to the market, for example, the sleep aid drug, it went to the market at a dosage that was double the dosage that women should really have had because it had been tested on men. And women started taking it and getting into like car accidents the next day because it wouldn't have left they hadn't metabolized it the same way. And it just, it hadn't occurred to anyone to study it in women, right? So that's the kind of problem that I do think women run into when they go into a doctor's office. Plus this whole legacy of hysteria, which I get into in some depth, but it's a little bit, yeah.
Absolutely. So I wanted to also when you spoke to your editor, she was a little bit hesitant at first, right? Like, are people going to want to read this? And obviously in the last 2 years, we've seen something called long COVID, right? So these are unexplained symptoms that seem to come in the aftermath of a COVID diagnosis. Not necessarily the disease itself, but the aftermath of the disease. And a lot of these illnesses are sort of fuzzy, and there's not a lot of diagnoses. And I'm curious, I'm sure, obviously, and I saw in the book, you definitely relate to this group of people, and you talk about how this is going to be a really, it's going to be a big burden on the healthcare system because a lot more people are going to be going through this.
Yeah. So, explicitly, the book talks specific, it's about chronic illness in some ways, broadly speaking, right? Because I'm really interested in the ways that we don't have a ready-made narrative for chronic illness, right? I think as a culture generally, separate even from long COVID, we just resist looking at chronic illness. We like to tell stories of overcoming and just do it, muscle through it, all of that. So that's why the book is subtitle is Reimagining Chronic Illness. But specifically in the book, the category of illness that I write about is this category of diseases that are often driven by dysfunction of the immune system and or the nervous system. And in particular, in one chapter, I talk about what some researchers call infection-associated conditions, which are conditions like long COVID. There's some reason to believe myalgic encephalomyelitis is one of these conditions, right? There's the whole question of tick-borne diseases that don't resolve, chronic Lyme disease, post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome, and indeed Epstein-Barr virus and the ways that it seems to help trigger in some genetically susceptible patients autoimmune disease like multiple sclerosis. There was a really big study that just came out showing that, and I report on someone who's working on its connection to lupus and shows that there's some kind of connection there, right? So I was already really interested in, and the book was in a sense already making this argument that, look, there's this emerging paradigm of medicine that really helps us understand these poorly understood and often stigmatized diseases, because the central through line of the book is that when we don't understand a disease well, and when we can't treat it easily, we stigmatize it, right? Which is to say, we reflexively see it as perhaps anxiety or another mental illness, rather than looking at the complex, nuanced way that maybe some of these patients have anxiety, but there's also other underlying biological realities. So the argument of the book is to say we need to really pay attention to this, and there's some really exciting research being done. So then I'm sort of finishing the book, and along comes the pandemic, and I have to tell you, I was being kept up at night because I just thought, oh my goodness, this virus sounds so bad. Based on all this work I've done with these virologists and microbiologists, like I'm really worried not just about this first, acute illness, but exactly what you're talking about, which is the possible epidemic of chronic illness that's going to follow. So as we now know, that has happened, right? And in the spring and summer of 2020, I began reporting on this for The Atlantic really early on, before much had been written about long COVID. And I was in patient groups online and hearing from people that they just weren't getting better. So I spent like 6 months shadowing patients and doctors at Mount Sinai, who were among the first to build a center for post-COVID care and to really try to take seriously this epidemic of chronic illness that is being triggered by COVID for reasons we don't fully understand still. So what's really interesting is that long COVID and many of the things that are shaping long COVID are really similar probably to things that are shaping myalgic encephalomyelitis, and even what might be contributing in some cases to, immune dysfunction following tick infection. And, there's different things there, but all these different theories are being thrown about in similar ways in all these diseases. And we just haven't done enough research, right? So the question is COVID, long COVID, going to help shine a light on this whole category of disease and help us kind of come up with a framework that lets us see it and study it and take it seriously? Or are we at a juncture where this sort of everyone's ready to move on and they're just going to marginalize and make invisible the patients with long COVID too? It's a really important moment that we're at, I think, in terms of the future of these illnesses.
What do you think is going to happen in that respect? I mean, I know there's been money and there's been attention paid to long COVID. We've sort of already gotten to the point where no, it's not in your head. So at least that's sort of ahead of where you were when you started.
I think the big difference is that, well, first of all, there's still a lot of people who are being told this is in your head, unfortunately. I mean, I was talking to someone the other day, I've been reporting, and there's a lot of ongoing not crediting the testimony of long COVID patients. I think the difference is that in these major academic medical centers, they are taking it absolutely seriously. And there's two reasons for that I think are really important to the possible kind of looking back and shining a light on all these diseases. One is that it was a mass event with a very clear cause, right? The pandemic happened, people got COVID, and all of a sudden they were sick. It's really hard to debate that reality, which is, by the way, exactly what happened to Lyme disease patients, decades ago, was that lots of people were saying got Lyme disease, then they said we're not better, and they were dismissed. So I do see this really important step forward, which is that this time people are saying, okay, we believe, medical scientists are saying, okay, we believe the COVID virus, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, your COVID infection is what caused this. But the question is, do we go back to the same ways of studying and thinking about these diseases, which is all too often, well, maybe these patients are deconditioned, or there was some sort of mass social anxiety that contributed to the condition? Or do we center, look, anxiety is an important thing to study, but it shouldn't be the majority of what we're looking at. And I think the big, big question is, what do we do with this funding? Are we going to center patients' narratives, and are we going to really listen to patients who have a lot to say and a lot of information and a lot of clues? Or are we going to marginalize them yet again? And I think part of the work in my book is to kind of point out all the ways that we as a society, and medical science specifically, likes to infantilize and sideline patients. And I mean, we can get into the complexity and the complex reasons for that, why there's this antagonism. Some of it has to do with doctors who are strapped for time and under so much pressure from insurance companies to move along patient to patient to patient and don't have time and energy for complex diseases. But part of it too is I think we just have an inherited cultural apparatus of thinking of sick people as somehow unreliable. And I really wanted to capture that and dramatize that so that it could speak to how we think more consciously about this moment in history.
Mhm, mhm. I hate to say it's a sort of a silver lining, but I mean, I guess this having COVID has really, really brought the themes of your book to the fore. And
Yeah.
I'm sure that's gratifying in some ways.
Yeah, I don't know if it's gratifying, but what it is, though, is, if I ever questioned the purpose of the book or why I was writing it, when the pandemic happened and I started hearing from people who were still sick, it just made me think the urgency is even more present, right? As a writer, as a thinker, as a public intellectual, like this matters just tremendously. We have a potential mass disabling event that we have the power, I think that's what we forget. We have the power to change the outcomes here in all kinds of ways, even if we don't get all the medical answers. We have the power to recognize and validate those patients. We have the power to create better disability policy. I mean, we have so much we can do. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it did redouble my, as you can tell, my commitment to this as a framework we need to really start talking about more.
You have some, obviously you're, you're well educated and you've done tons of research. And there's a moment in the book where I sort of feel like, you get desperate, right? And so you go to sort of some quack doctors, for lack of a better word, and you start like doing what they were telling you to do. So could you tell us a little bit about how you got to that moment that you, someone who maybe knew better was still going to see someone like that?
Yeah, well, I think part of what I'm trying to do is kind of complicate the, authority versus quack model and sort of come to the question of who we go to for care and what we're willing to do from a slightly different perspective than I think we're used to talking about it from. And I think my hope here is that I could explain in a sort of more intimate way, why patients try different things, right? And in my case, what I really was trying to show is that I had knocked on every kind of specialist door. I had been to so many revered specialists and I was still incredibly sick. And none of them were talking to one another. And none of them were asking me questions like, what's interfering most with your life? Okay, I don't know what's wrong with you, but how could I help you live your life a little bit more? If I could get you 10% more energy, what would you want to do with it? How can I, and no one was asking those questions. No one was saying, how is this fatigue impacting you and limiting your life? And at that point, I was really facing, having to potentially give up working, all kinds of things that were really scary. I couldn't have children. I really wanted to have a family. So what I really hope to show is that it's quite rational at that point when you're coming up empty to start looking into other kinds of explanations. And it's in fact quite rational, I think, to explore the idea that the body is more than a disconnected set of parts that don't really speak to one another, and start to think about and talk to, practitioners and people practicing integrative medicine and functional medicine about how can they help you live. And, I was on a radio show today saying, functional medicine really helped me survive during this period. So these were MDs who were not quacks. They were really MDs, but they were interested also in nutrition and lifestyle and like how might food be affecting this, which is something that's impacting a lot of long COVID patients too, is a lot of food intolerances and lots of immunological dysfunction that's manifesting in funny ways. But, as you get more and more desperate, you're willing to try more and more things. And if you are in a system where no one is crediting your testimony, I think it does make you feel like there's not that much to lose, right? I'm not getting help. I'm suffering. I've lost life as I knew it, as I wanted to live it. And so in my case, I ended up letting a doctor who I really didn't trust do this ozone treatment that was, risky because it involved taking blood out and doing things to it and putting it back in. So it was not a low level intervention. And I really didn't trust this guy. So yeah, I try to write about that to show, this is what can happen, but I really want to explain how you get there. And also that you're kind of making a bet, right? Your life is disappearing. I thought I was going to die. No one was helping me. And so I was gambling. I was trying different things because that was what was left to me. And some of those things really helped, like acupuncture and food, changing my diet. Yeah.
And it's really just a fascinating part of the story, that, when you get to that point, you're willing to try whatever someone tells you will work.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I don't think it's necessarily what someone tells you. It's what, well, I mean, sometimes there are people who tell you, but I think a lot of the kind of care I was seeking out were people who were actually going to really listen to me, and based on what I was saying, help me figure out what was and wasn't working for me. So like in my case, I am actually really, this is such a mundane example, but it has a big impact on day-to-day life, which is that I can't eat eggs. They make me incredibly sick, like kind of feel like I have a terrible hangover for a day. And, it was really a functional medicine doctor who figured that out. And although it wasn't the cause of my illness and it didn't transform my life, it made my life like a little more livable, right? And that made me have that much more energy. And one reason I wrote that whole section is to show, when we're thinking about and writing about the care of the chronically ill, part of what we should be talking about is not just medication, not just cures, not just whatever, but really what it's like to live day after day, not feeling well and having a whole host of things make you feel worse, that you don't exactly know what they are and what they're doing. And, why was I okay some days and other days just incredibly sick? And so I do think we need a revolution in the care of chronically ill patients that is analogous to the revolution of palliative care, right? Where palliative care came in and said, let's stop just throwing medication at these dying patients and pretending that they're not dying. Let's say, okay, we acknowledge we can't cure you. You have this time left. It's real time. How do you want to spend it as a person, right? And I think we need something similar in chronic illness care.
So as a writer, I wanted to talk to you. You have a chapter on illness as a metaphor, and I'm curious where that came from and why it was sort of so important for you to put into the book.
Mm-hmm. Illness as metaphor. Yeah. So the book is really influenced by Susan Sontag's really important book, Illness as Metaphor, in which Sontag, who had breast cancer but doesn't write about it very personally, writes about the fact that at that time when she published the book, which was 1978, a lot of people with breast cancer were being told that in some sense their breast cancer was caused by repressed emotions. This was a really popular cultural narrative. And Sontag really bridled at that as a patient. She was like, I don't believe that my breast cancer was caused by my own repressed emotions. And so she wrote a book pretty savagely dismantling, first identifying and then dismantling the ways in which when we don't understand a disease, we tend as a culture to kind of make up a story about it, right? And so she was very anti, writing sort of metaphors about illness. This is sometimes misunderstood as people will be like, well, why didn't she want people to describe pain metaphorically? That's not what she was doing. She was trying to say that cultures make metaphors, right? That the culture had made a metaphor of breast cancer, of tuberculosis. So part of what I'm arguing in my book is that the kind of current illness as metaphor are these particular category of poorly understood diseases like autoimmune disease, fibromyalgia. The list could go really far, could go on. It's many of the ones I've talked about, long COVID, where they are diseases onto which we project a lot of assumptions of our time and of our culture. And in particular, one of the things that's really noticeable is that we live in this like frenetic culture of productivity, right? I'm part of it, especially as a young person, where we're kind of, the truism about late capitalism, right? We're always connected, we're always doing, we've never done enough. And chronic illness really doesn't sit well with late capitalism, right? Chronic illness, you never know when you're going to be sick. You never know when you have to take a day off. You're not totally reliable on that 9-to-5 schedule. And so I had been really interested in how when you read 19th century novels or 18th century novels, there's often a sick woman in them who's often an aunt living with a family who hasn't had children, and she's sort of upstairs and she comes downstairs and has dinner, right? She's in Proust, she's in all sorts of novels, but there was kind of a cultural space for chronically ill women, right? In some ways. And anyway, so I was really interested in the ways in which we don't have that space in our culture, and therefore what kinds of stories do we tell about these people? And the story we tend to tell is that these people are anxious or hypochondriacal. But I was also really interested because on the message boards where I spent time in mostly patient groups of people with autoimmune disease, I was seeing over and over this idea that autoimmune patients felt that because their immune system had turned on their own body, they were reading that metaphorically to mean that they were somehow living an inauthentic life, or they were somehow responsible for their own illness, and that something about a divided self was causing disease, which is a really understandable kind of story, right? And it was in fact a story I had told myself too, and I still sometimes do. But I wanted to step back from that and think about the ways that that's a story, I think also that our culture is kind of feeding us, and that late capitalism feeds us, which is that it's somehow our fault, as opposed to there being a systemic problem, which there clearly is, right? And I really wanted to sort of pivot, show this habit, and then pivot to show, if autoimmune diseases really are rising at so-called epidemic rates, as Noel Rose, who is the father of autoimmune disease research in this country, started a center at Johns Hopkins. It was really important. He was a big source for my book. Then this is no one's individual problem. This is a social structural problem. It's something in the environment. It's something about our food system. It's something about viruses and hygiene. Who knows? We don't know what it is, but it's not an individual problem of a person not living their authentic life, right?
So before I'm going to move on to some questions from the audience, but before I do that, I wanted to just ask you sort of how you feel, how you function these days. I know you have 2 children now, which that's very exciting, that you were able to, feel well enough to do that. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you deal with today.
Yeah. So I, ultimately ended up with a cluster of diagnoses and have been treated for a number of them. And I'm doing much better. But, I live with something called POTS, which is a kind of dysautonomia. So when I sort of overdo it by standing up too much, for example, something as simple as standing for too long can make me really crash afterward. So, I would say I am functioning at like 60% to 80% a lot of the time, but it all comes at a cost. This month I've been doing a lot and I feel a lot sicker as a result. And it's just a very real reminder that things can come out of the blue. I never am totally in control of this. And as functional as I am, there's a lot I do to make my life possible. And, a lot of very kind of strict routines I have to follow, and things like I can't walk too far, or I can't get really hot or really cold because that makes me have a sort of nervous system crash, and things like that are really complex. But my kids, I'm lucky enough to have 2 kids, and they're a source of total joy and also exhaustion. So thank you for asking. Yeah.
Well, this is so far. I mean, this has been wonderful, and I'm excited to see what we can some of the questions we have here. I have one here from Mel Madden, and the question is, how do you view being an editor versus a writer? What advice do you give to someone who is aiming to do both?
Yeah, I love that question, a writing question and an editing question. I have loved in my career getting to toggle between periods where I'm mostly an editor and periods where I'm mostly a writer. I started my career as an editor at the New Yorker. I edited fiction and nonfiction. And one of the amazing things about editing is that you can be in service of other people's ideas, right? And it's less fraught. Writing is, for me, it's my true love. It's the way I make sense of the world, and I need it in my life, but it's more fraught, right? If it's not going well, you feel like you're failing at something, and it's a lot of effort to bring, your ideas to the surface. And as an editor, I can help so many other people, right, with their writing, with their helping them get published for the first time and sort of launch a career. And so that's just been an incredibly gratifying and wonderful experience. I also teach writing, and I love teaching writing for that reason too, which is just to bring the struggles you've dealt with, the solutions you've come to, and to be able to share them with others makes the work of writing even more meaningful. Yeah.
I have another craft question from Courtney Cowgill. How did you approach balancing personal narrative with reportage?
It's so funny. I'm teaching a public writing class at Yale, and the session today was I'm co-teaching it with each of us talking about our writing. And I said to them, I think the biggest craft challenge, the biggest writing challenge of this book was figuring out how to construct a voice, because I think it was the voice that was flexible enough to contain both this really intimate personal journey that I wanted, well, I don't know if I wanted to share, but I felt I had to share in order to really render this experience with authenticity and visibility. And how to balance that with sort of what could be quite dense reportage and a lot of scientific detail and history and sort of argument about society and politics. And the way I approached it was, it took a long time, but I really thought about it through voice, right? That this had to be a voice that the reader could believe in what really did happen, which was that I started out with a really fair amount of ignorance about my own body and about our medical system. And through necessity, learned a tremendous amount along the way, and was professionally able to, call people on the phone and get them to talk to me in ways that I could now share. So I had to really construct at the beginning of the book that I didn't know very much, and that I was going to be going on this quest. And a lot of the work was about slotting in information at points where narratively it would have made sense for me to learn that information, right, while sticking to the timeline. So it was tricky. There were a few things I had to move around and then change scenes, because I was like, oh wait, that scene happened before I learned that information, and now I've got to go put it back earlier. So it was a lot of really careful craft put into that part of it. Yeah.
So Chris asks, says autoimmune diseases often have an underlying specific cause, whether it's food, bacteria, tick bite, etc. Were you able to determine the specific root cause of your disease?
Yeah, so I did have Lyme disease and a co-infection that was clearly and has become only kind of more clear because I've gotten even more clear testing over the years, causing a lot of my symptoms. I will never know, did it trigger the autoimmune disease, or would I have experienced autoimmune disease anyway? Because as I've said, there was a lot of autoimmune disease in my family, and we know that there is a genetic component of autoimmune disease, though that genetic component usually does need to kind of be put under pressure by a trigger. But I had, there were lots of potential triggers. There were lots of viruses I was exposed to. I did spend the summer in a moldy house when I was really, in my 20s before I got sick. So I'll never know. And that's part of the work of the book too, is to say, I think one of the real challenges, or one of the real journeys that I went on, journey is sort of an overused word, but a trajectory, was to learn to live with what I'm never going to know, right? Which is so hard, really hard. Yeah.
Okay, here's a question from, let's see. This says, how do we balance advocating for our medical and workers' rights with protecting our privacy around something as personal as health and struggles in light of the stigma attached to many chronic illnesses. And I guess, there's a cool thing where you've now put yourself out there as, hi, I've got a chronic illness. And I guess, so I think that's a great question from Julia here.
Can you say the beginning part?
How do we balance advocating for this is medical and workers' rights while protecting our privacy around something as personal as health and the struggles in light of the stigma attached to many chronic illnesses?
Yeah, I think it's really hard, right? I think anyone who does that advocacy is, if they want to remain private, is risking that privacy, right? I think there's no clean way to do it. I obviously felt that I needed to be just not private about it to kind of make things that I wanted to, things that are often murky that I wanted to bring to the light. But I've been talking to a lot of people this past week in particular who, are on disability or fear, they're holding on to their jobs, but they fear, it's precarious. So I think there's just a lot there that's hard, but there's so much one can do online now. And, obviously in online communities, you don't always have to reveal exactly who you are. So I don't have a great answer to that question, but I recognize the struggle and the challenge there. I mean,
this one, yeah.
Go ahead.
This one's from Hannah, and she says, how does your experience with multiple writing genres inform your writing as a whole? For instance, how does being a poet make you a better science writer and vice versa?
Yeah, I thank you for this question. I appreciate it. I like to think that making me a poet, the fact that I'm a poet and a reporter was really important to this book. And I think insofar as I hoped that was true, it was because some of what I found in medicine was this really important adherence to what was known, right? To evidence-based medicine, which is, again, really important. I am a believer in science. Science is how we get out of this problem that we have of chronic illness that's poorly understood. But at the same time, it was unsatisfying as a patient, as a person actually, who lived with illness, to just be told, we don't know, and therefore I can't tell you, and therefore basically goodbye, right? Because I still had to live my life. This was my one life, right? And so what I really wanted to do was to find ways to kind of humanize and animate that experience of being the person who's at the edge of medical knowledge, right? So that we could all pause and think a little bit more together about what that is like, right? And why, again, the person at the edge of medical knowledge might be willing to try risky experimental things or want more, right? Because we want our lives, we want the dignity of our suffering to be recognized and treated. So I think that that was really important. And also because temperamentally, I'm sympathetic to the doctors in the medical system that I'm sort of holding up to the light and critiquing. And I think I needed that poet's resistance to dogmatism in a way to have that, right? And then I think the kind of being a reporter and science writer, that part was important. Actually, the first editing I did at the New Yorker was all science editing. So I edited people who wrote on medicine for the New Yorker. And I think just that was important to the poet in me, because otherwise it might have been a sort of flightier, more fanciful book. And part of what I am trying to do is offer really helpful knowledge. And, it's not a self-help book. It's not, I wanted it to be a little bit timeless. So it's not supposed to be, here's the latest studies in medicine, but it is supposed to be something of a guideline, right? Or a sort of framework. Yeah.
Thank you. And from Nora, we have, what advice does Meghan have for writers seeking to publish memoirs on illness and loss?
Yeah. I think figuring out your own strengths as a writer, right? And embracing them. I always tell this to my writing students, but there's the writer we want to be, right? There's always some writer we really admire. We're like, I want to write like that writer. And certainly I try, for example, Sontag is someone I really admire. So my first version of this book was very Sontagian, not first version, but the first draft of my introduction. It was very Sontagian, which was to say very dry. I just explained that when she wrote illness as metaphor, she had cancer, but she didn't even mention that in the book. And I just realized, wait, this is not who I am. I'm a writer I am a poet. I do like to dramatize and to set things in lived experience. So I think for you to think about what you do best as a writer, what are the gifts you can bring to the page, and really be very clear about what you want to say and how it matters and how it's different from other people. But also to remember that, it's funny that the path to universality is through just the specificity of your experience. The more you can animate and bring to life your experience on the page, the more compelling and urgent that story and memoir is going to be.
We have a question here about pitching. And it says, when you first began pitching reputable news outlets with these types of stories, New Yorker, Paris Review, New York Times, did you cold pitch and make your way through slush piles, or did you seek representation first? Any advice for freelancers?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because I was already in the world of journalism, I was working as an assistant at the New Yorker and then an editor. I did have, was able to build relationships and then sort of start with really short pieces. I first wrote kind of unsigned book reviews for Publishers Weekly, and then book reviews for the LA Times Book Review and the New York Times, and then started writing longer pieces for the Atlantic, the New Yorker. I have done both. I have cold pitched editors. I do have an agent, but my agent only represents my books. So I'm usually pitching people myself, and certainly have cold pitched, but I've been lucky enough that I know a lot of people. So in terms of how this helps you, I think it's great to cold pitch people. It's a skill to develop. Again, the same advice I just gave about memoir writing applies here, which is to say, in my public writing class that I just taught this afternoon, I was saying to them, when you send a pitch, there's 3 things you have to do. You have to explain what your story is and why it's distinctive, right? What your distinctive angle or kind of approach is, why it matters, why it's distinctive, and why you, right? Those are the 3 things. Why it matters could also be why now, but right, those are what an editor is looking for. Why this matters to their audience, what's different about it from every other long COVID piece, and why you're the person to write it. So I think if you really work on getting that down, and it, which is really hard, I know, but you can do it. It's worth cold pitching and trying and building those relationships over time. And any relationships you can build are important. That's why a program like this is so helpful.
Are you doing more writing about long COVID yourself?
I am. I'm currently talking to the New York Times Magazine. I don't know if I'm allowed to say it. I think I can say it, about a kind of, I think I was saying this earlier, but I think we're at such an important juncture for long COVID. And so I'm trying to report out, what are we doing with the funding? Where is it going? And then more crucially, like, what is it like to have lived with long COVID for 3 years, and what is happening now? Because one thing I think is really important is it's not static, right? Like, you might live your first year with long COVID and be able to kind of muscle through it at work, and maybe then you just can't anymore. And now you're going on disability and facing a really different life. So yeah, I really want to keep writing about long COVID.
Terrific. We have a question here. Through your research, have you found any practitioners that are interested in spending more time working with patients with chronic illness? Do you see a movement toward this? And I guess my editorial comment and question would be, do we have a healthcare system set up for people who are chronically ill?
Yeah, we do not have a healthcare system set up for people who are chronically ill. So there is a chapter in the book called Solutions, which is a really sort of undercooked chapter, if I say so myself. Like, there needs to be more. I could write a whole book just about this question, and I think I will continue writing about the solutions here. But I saw a question in the chat earlier about kind of, is part of the problem for doctors just the whole setup of healthcare, right? These sort of building blocks of our appointments are like 15-minute long and all that. So yes, we need a healthcare system that is better able to offer coordinated care, that is better at looking at sort of the personal manifestation of illness and what it means to live with a disease as opposed to have a disease. We need to give doctors the space and time to take really complex case histories and become medical detectives. We're not letting doctors do that work, as our earlier commenter noted, because they just have to keep moving on, right, to kind of hit those markers often set by insurance companies. So yeah, am I answering the question? I think
Yes, I think so.
one.
I have another question here that was actually, it's quite interesting. It says, have you found that chronic illness patients who have struggled with both medically and professionally for years, even decades, feel slighted by the rise in validation of long COVID as a real disease?
Feel slighted? Is that the?
Yeah, that was the question.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. I have seen in online communities that some people do. Let's put it this way. There are so many people whose very real, very debilitating medical conditions have been slighted and trivialized and ignored for years and decades, right? And so people are completely understandably, I'm one of them, right? Angry and frustrated and feel overlooked. And I think fear that there's limited attention and only so much to go around. And so, yeah, I have certainly seen some people saying, we've been saying this for decades and we need this help. And everyone's talking about long COVID, but what about us? We've been here so much longer. I think there's also a sense in a lot of these communities that, and certainly I will say from the researchers I'm talking to, and this reminds me of the part of the question I didn't answer earlier, the researchers and medical practitioners I'm talking to are really invested in long COVID, both from a research perspective and from a treatment perspective, very much feel that the attention on long COVID is bringing their attention to things like myalgic encephalomyelitis, fibromyalgia, tick-borne illness. And they are seeing all of these interconnections. And, so the hope is that although that feeling of slightedness is there, that, we can all use our voices to say, these are tools in a toolbox that can affect many people. And we need to actually use this moment to help people whose diseases have been ignored. That reminds me that the earlier question was, are there people who are really doing a great job with chronic illness care? And I will say that I've been very inspired, it really is the word I would use if I don't use it lightly, by the work of people at the Center for Post-COVID Care at Mount Sinai and Mount Sinai more broadly, in particular, David Petrino, who's not at the Center for Post-COVID Care, but has become an advocate and someone who's really trying to change how medicine deals with chronically ill patients and get away from algorithms and much more towards centering patients' narrative. There's a woman named Amy Kontorovich, who's a cardiologist who treats Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. There are people out there, and I do think the pandemic is actually bringing more of them out and putting more of them in touch with one another. So I am a little optimistic on that front.
And I wanted to, my last question for you. First, I wanted to thank you so much for your honesty and your candor. And I want to say that a lot of the people in the chat are just so thrilled that you've written this book and they have similar experiences that they, have shared. And it's very, I guess, really, it must be very gratifying to you to sort of see that your book is resonating.
It's really, really meaningful. It really is. And for every moment where, writers are sensitive and stressed out creatures, and for every moment that there's like one mean comment, and I'm like, oh, why did I do this? It's just so meaningful, which happens. It's been so meaningful and so important. And I'm going to get emotional, but kind of reinvigorating to see that response and to see the need. So yeah.
Terrific. And I'm going to turn it over to Rosalind to wrap us up here.
Yes, that was wonderful, ladies. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this evening. We have more chats in development, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a great evening.